Late on a Sunday night in 1970, police respond to an anonymous phone call. They're called to a domestic dispute at an address in North Omaha's Black Ghetto. The house seems abandoned, but to investigate further, the officers decide to go in. In the blast, one officer died and 4 were injured. A year later, 2 black radicals, David Rice and Edward Poindexter, were jailed for life for this bombing. Today they're still in jail and unlikely to be released. Both men believe they were framed.
I was reminded constantly that we're going to get you, we're going to get you. Nigger, we're going to get you. We're not going to rest till we get you. So I said, well, good luck, you know. And they were right, of course.
On a winter evening in 1968, Kenneth and Caroline Olson prepare to play tennis. 2 men rob them and order them to lie face down. Caroline Olson died in the attack. Geronimo Pratt, a young Black Power activist, was jailed for life for this murder. For more than 20 years, Pratt has maintained he is innocent.
I didn't kill Mrs. Olson. I didn't murder anyone. I'd rather for people not to listen to me. I'd rather for people to go to the facts. You could listen to what a person say all day, but it's best to check the facts out. And the facts speaks for themselves.
David Rice, Edward Poindexter, and Geronimo Pratt were prominent figures in the militant Black Power organization, the Black Panthers. All 3 men believe that they were framed by the police and the FBI because of their political activity. They say they are America's political prisoners. Geronimo Pratt was born in the Mississippi Delta town of Morgan City. During his childhood, the town was still segregated between black and white. Geronimo was sent to an all-black high school. When he left school at 17, Pratt volunteered for service in Vietnam. He served 2 years in action and was twice wounded. He was decorated for bravery and promoted to sergeant. Like many other black soldiers in Vietnam, Geronimo Pratt followed the progress of the civil rights struggle back home.
I was standing on the bunker, and the news came from someone's radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And it was automatic reaction from everyone. It was just a silence, a big silence, and it was a very sad day. Even though Martin Luther King wasn't so much of our hero, he was our mothers and fathers' heroes. Because we were more, excited about the Malcolm X type, or the more, fiery and militant, because of our age and persuasions. But Martin had been killed, and something was about to happen. I mean, you just knew it. And that's something you knew you better have been on the right side of the fence, and you knew you had to be involved because no one could escape it,
Appalled by Martin Luther King's assassination, Pratt left the army and returned to America. He joined the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were a militant Black Power organization committed to revolutionary social change in America. They also urged the black community to defend itself against racial attacks.
Organizing them and giving them political knowledge about the true situation, and organizing them and teaching ourselves that we must arm ourselves. We have to put a shotgun in every door, from door to door, from block to block, from community to community, from city to city, from state to state, across this racist nation, so we can have the power in our hands. So we can have the power in our hands.
Geronimo Pratt rose to head the Los Angeles chapter of the Panthers. Kathleen Cleaver was also a leading figure in the movement.
It was a very, very tense time. People were followed, they were spied on. We felt the police were trying to destroy our organization, and that we had no intention of letting that happen. It had the feeling of the early stages of a war. Everyone was very tense, very excited, and we were determined that this was the time to make a big revolutionary change.
In July 1969, hostility between the Los Angeles police and the Panthers came to a head. After a 14-hour gun battle, the police arrested the Black Panther leadership, including Geronimo Pratt. Pratt was then charged with the tennis court murder, which had taken place 3 years before. This word-for-word transcript is the only record of his trial. We've used it to reconstruct the evidence which convicted Pratt in 1972. The key to the prosecution case was the evidence of a former Black Panther called Julius Butler. He testified in court that on the evening of December the 18th, 1968, Geronimo Pratt came to his apartment and produced a gun.
Anybody see you?
No.
Then, according to Butler, Pratt confessed to him that he had just killed a woman on a tennis court. To back up Butler's testimony, there were two eyewitnesses. The first was a woman called Barbara Reed. Barbara Reed ran a shop near the scene of the murder. She testified that she remembered Geronimo Pratt coming into her shop with another man minutes before the shooting. The second eyewitness, Kenneth Olson, was the husband of the murdered woman. He identified Geronimo Pratt as one of the men who shot his wife. The prosecution then presented forensic evidence. A ballistics expert testified that bullets found on the tennis court matched with the gun belonging to Geronimo Pratt. The evidence seemed convincing, but even so, the jury took 10 days to reach a verdict.
When we delivered our verdict, the jury foreman stood up and said that we had found him guilty. The defense attorneys requested an individual polling of the jury, and for each count, we had to indicate guilty. After we had done so, I believe it was 4 times. I don't remember exactly how many counts there were against him. As that day, by the way, he was in hand and leg chains with prison clothes on, as he had not been during the trial before. And as he walked by us, he called us racist pigs.
Even Pratt's defense team admit the prosecution had a good case.
There were 2 eyewitnesses that claimed that they could identify Pratt as the man who had committed the murder. Although they were shaken somewhat on cross-examination, still juries tend to regard eyewitness identification evidence as very solid. There was an alleged confession by Pratt to another member of the Black Panthers, who was actually a man who was the principal witness against him at the trial, claimed that Pratt had told him he had done it. And you know, those are strong lines of evidence. And it's not hard to see why he was convicted at the first trial, given what the prosecution was able to produce and what the defense didn't know at the time.
Geronimo Pratt has always said that on the night of the murder he was 500 miles away from Los Angeles, at the Black Panther headquarters in Oakland. At the trial, this alibi was not believed, but since then, new witnesses have been found.
I remember that Geronimo was in Oakland with me during the week of the murder. And I remember it because of significant events that happened, but also because my job was to log people into Central Headquarters. I was in charge of security. I was the person that, when people came from out of town and when Geronimo came, he had to check in with me in order to find out what was on the agenda.
According to Landon Williams, on the night of the murder, there were a series of meetings around Oakland. Pratt attended them all. One meeting was held at the house of a white supporter of the Black Panthers.
I'm certain about what happened during that period, not from sitting back now and sort of recollecting 20 years later, but when these things were happening, I got locked up. I was arrested by the Denver County Police and the FBI and locked into isolation for 2.5 years. From June 1969 through through October 1971. And I had limited stimulus and contact with other people. So what I did was all these things, I continually replayed these in my mind. So now, although it's still 20 years later, there are impressions that were imprinted into my mind because it was all I had to deal with while I was in isolation. So I know emphatically that Geronimo wasn't in Los Angeles, but in fact was there with me in Oakland at that time.
This confirmation of Pratt's alibi is just one part of a mass of new evidence found since the trial. Our investigation has now revealed serious flaws in every aspect of the prosecution case. Many members of the jury were apparently swayed to convict by the strength of the forensic evidence. But this is now highly suspect. At the trial, a ballistics expert called Dwayne Wolfer convinced the jury that shells found on the tennis court had been fired from Pratt's gun. But Wolfer's professional credibility is now in doubt.
Well, Dwayne Wolfer's rather notorious. He's mishandled some large cases, including the Robert Kennedy assassination and some preliminary work on the Charles Manson murders and other cases. In fact, the Court of Appeals called him incompetent, and he was sued in connection with the Robert Kennedy case at one point and was deposed. And I've read his deposition, and I don't believe the man could pass a 9th grade science test, really. He was the forensic expert, though, for the prosecution in Pratt's trial.
It isn't just defense lawyers who distrust Wolfer. In 1975, the California Appeal Court described his testimony as given with a reckless disregard for the truth and negligently false. The court said it was obvious Wolfer knew very little about what he was talking about. In the light of these judgments, Wolfer's ballistic testimony now appears worthless. Even at the time of the trial, the eyewitness identifications were questionable. Kenneth Olson, the husband of the murdered woman, and Barbara Reed, the hobby shop woman, both made their identifications several years after the murder. Mrs. Reed gave many conflicting descriptions of a man she admitted she saw for only a few seconds.
On the night of the murder itself, a forensic drawing, an identikit type of thing, was done by a police artist, and the description of the short man that she gave then didn't resemble Pratt at all. And at trial, they were able to confront her with this old drawing, which she had to concede didn't look like Pratt at all, but she said, well, I remember him better now. Those were her words.
The hobby shop woman was one of the shakiest witnesses the prosecution had. There's a joke that that prejudiced people say, oh, you can't tell the difference between any black or any other ethnic group. They all look the same. I immediately thought of that when that woman began to speak. It was clear to me that in her mind, every black individual looked the same.
Kenneth Olson was more convincing. In court, he showed no hesitation in identifying Pratt as one of the men who shot his wife.
Mr. Olson was obviously an individual that we all felt for. We had seen pictures of his wife murdered and her dead body. So when he got up on the stand, the feeling that we had was, this is a man that, I mean, you almost felt guilty not believing him. But His eyewitness was, I would say he's about 50-50 believable. There was one part of you that said, boy, if somebody was looking at me with a gun, I would remember what he looked like. And I remember the jury foreman saying, don't you think you'd remember the person that shot your wife?
But it's recently emerged that a year before Pratt's trial, Kenneth Olson identified someone else as his wife's killer, a man who looked nothing like Geronimo Pratt.
And he got up and said, that's the man who did it, and pointed at Geronimo Pratt. That's devastating evidence. What the defense lawyers didn't know, what the jury never knew, is that a year before, in a police lineup room, he did the same thing. He said, that's the man who did it, and the voice convinces me. He was 100% sure, and he picked out someone totally different. He picked out a guy named Perkins, who the police never prosecuted.
William Dunn is an appeal court judge who was outvoted in trying to grant Geronimo Pratt a new trial.
The question is whether or not it would have made a difference to the jury that Olson had identified some other person. I think it might well have made a difference for this reason. If 12 people are sitting in judgment and the crucial issue is, did the defendant commit the crime, and it appears that the victim of the crime on a previous occasion, when arguably his memory was better, was not sure, in that he either identified somebody else or said he couldn't positively identify the defendant. It seems to me that ought to be made to the jury, because it's an equivocal identification. When you just say at the time of trial, yes, the defendant did it, and it's not made known to the jury that on a previous occasion you were not so sure, then it seems to me it makes a difference in terms of how they judge the case and how they judge your credibility.
Without the discredited eyewitness and forensic evidence, the only testimony still linking Geronimo Pratt to the murder is that of Julius Butler. According to Butler, Pratt came straight to his apartment from the scene of the crime and confessed to the murder. Butler told the court that he was so worried by what he heard that he decided to make a written record of Pratt's confession. Butler then said that he telephoned a friend, Duane Rice, and arranged a meeting in order to give him the confession document for safekeeping. In a statement, Butler's friend, Duane Rice, explained what happened next. He said that just as Julius Butler was giving him the confession document, 2 FBI men rushed forward and tried to take it from him. Rice says he was amazed that they appeared to know exactly what they were waiting for.
Give me that letter. Where are you going to get this letter? FBI.
This thing that was supposedly had taken place between just the two of them. Actually, there were at least 2 FBI agents present at the scene. They had to have been called by Butler. Butler had set up the meeting with Rice at a certain street corner, and if the FBI was present at that street corner at that very moment, it can only be because Butler had also called them.
Was Butler in fact working for the FBI? At Pratt's trial, Butler was asked on oath whether he was an FBI informer. He repeatedly denied that he was. New evidence shows he was lying. During the period in question, Butler was meeting regularly with FBI agents as an informer. The FBI's own records, now released under the Freedom of Information Act, show Julius Butler was an FBI informant at the very time he first came forward with his story about Pratt's confession.
For the information of San Francisco Division, captioned individual and admitted ex-member of the Black Panther Party, BPP, in Los Angeles, is furnishing information to the Los Angeles Division on a confidential basis.
If in fact Julio Butler was an FBI informant, it seems to me that would have made a substantial difference to the trier of fact, the jury. Not from the standpoint that he was or wasn't an informant, but bearing upon his credibility. if he comes into court and testifies to one thing and it turns out that that testimony is untrue, then he has engaged in duplicity in the courtroom. And if he engages in duplicity with regard to that, then arguably he might not have been totally truthful with regard to the essential testimony, which was that Mr. Pratt had confessed to the crime.
Had I known whether that Julius Butler was an FBI informant, I would have disregarded his testimony completely. I think it's unconscionable that we did not have the full evidence when we are asked to make a decision that has such an impact. And in effect, we were made to be puppets. They molded the case for us to hear what they wanted us to hear and not the whole story. And I feel duped.
Not only was the jury not told that Julius Butler was an informer, they were not told about the existence of a secret FBI counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was an illegal operation set up to destroy the Black Panthers. It used widespread bugging and surveillance, as well as a dirty tricks campaign against Panther leaders. Newly obtained documents reveal the scope of COINTELPRO operations against the Black Panther Party, the BPP. One directive orders:
officers are instructed